Round 5, Game 2 of the modern PTQ Dragon's Maze. James Corwood's gone a game up against Matt Light, and we're going to be having a quick think about the sideboards here. What can Matt do here against James's deck?
I think we might see a couple of spirit links from Matt just to try and keep his life total as high as possible. I'm not sure he needs to do too much to his deck, to tell you the truth. He should be fairly well positioned. The only thing he might bring in, if he's got some sort of artifact hate, might be something like that, just because most of the hatred for the Aura's deck is going to be artifact based. So things like Chalice of the Void and Spell Scout, which incidentally is what I expect to see from Jim, to tell you the truth, from the sideboard.
So how aggressive does Matt need to be with his starting hand here?
He needs to be quite aggressive with his start overall, because he has to... He's more than likely going to realise that Chalice of the Void is a card that he could very easily be up against. And if he is up against that card, he will have to get his permanents into play quickly. Unless he has a way to deal with the Chalice, of course, at which point he shouldn't be too worried. That's Hyena Umber that's on his Slippery Bogle there, so... You might see a card like Engineered Explosives come from Jim as well, but that's Chalice of the Void for 1, which is going to shut down an awful lot of Matt's deck at this point, so...
Doesn't really hurt James so much.
Not really, he's already got his Noble Hierarchy in play. The only thing it might do is stop him casting Path to Exile, but since Path isn't really a very good card against Matt's deck anyway...
You'd assume he would have took those out?
Well, Matt does play Core Spirit Dancer, so if James sees or thinks that he's up against Spirit Dancer, he might well keep his paths in, just for that guy, because he can get out of control very, very easily. In fact, there is Core Spirit Dancer. Matt taking 1 off his Horizon Canopy.
It's important to note that Matt can now still play all of his 1-drops and draw a card.
Yeah, because the Core Spirit Dancer triggers on casting the spell, so whether it's countered or not, he still draws a card.
And indeed, he's probably going to have to do that a fair bit to get to his important 2-drops now.
Yeah, I mean, he's still got Spirit Mantle and Daybreak Coronet he can cast onto his Slippery Bogle, so... Just that 1 Chalice of the Void isn't going to lock him out of the game just yet.
Obviously, the big worry is James having a second one.
Yeah, Chalice on 2 would be pretty brutal for Matt at this point. Spellskite as well. As you can see, Jim's coming with pretty much all the hate at this point for...
so this now shuts down pretty much all of Matt's deck due to the fact that he can't get rid of the Spellskite.
Yeah, he can't cast Path to Exile or anything like that. The only thing he can do is cast... he's basically reduced to casting Daybreak Coronet at this point, because that's the only thing the Spellskite can't redirect. And in fact, that is Daybreak Coronet, the poster boy for turning 20-cent cards into $10 cards, I would guess, over the past couple of years.
James was just asking whether he could redirect it to the Spellskite there.
And Matt, of course, was like, you can target it with the Spellskite if you wish.
He won't stop him paying 2 life if that's what he wants to do.
No, but very much like Go for the Throat, you can't redirect it to a Spellskite, so...
And we get certainly Matt got a lot of this all throughout the day. People picking up his Daybreak Coronets and saying, what does that do?
Yep, we got a reader, as the expression goes. Matt's going to take another point, and he's going to just draw a card off his Ethereal Armor. Now this is the slight problem that you can occasionally get with a really hateful sideboard, in that you can draw a ton of answers, but as you can see here, Jim just isn't putting any pressure on Matt whatsoever, so that 1/5/5 Bogle is going to be enough to beat him up unless James can muster some kind of defense here. And you do often have this problem. Certainly people have had it with red decks in the past, where they bring in 1,000,000 chills, and all that happens is that they draw answers, but the red deck will have answers for their answers and still be in an aggressive mode.
Now we have a Chalice of the Void on 2, just to shut down the deck completely.
Yep, feel free to fall asleep anytime, guys. So unless Matt has a splash of black for Abrupt Decay, or he has Crows and Grip available to him, he's not going to be able to resolve any further spells this game. So that 5/5 better make it. And the Gavany Township from Jim's going to mean that at some point, if he can survive long enough, he's just going to make a 1/6 spell skite and just hold off that bogle pretty much forever. I mean, Matt can get onto a very high life total for sure, but eventually James is just going to resolve Wilt Leaf Legion, a gold creature, and that's going to be enough to see him through. So now I think we're going to be seeing Matt powering through his deck, trying to see if there's any kind of answer that he can find.
Let's talk, while we're waiting for sort of the inevitable, I suppose, to take place, let's talk a little bit about both these decks and what you sort of expect from them from the rest of the tournament.
I think that the Auras deck has a little bit of surprise package in this tournament. Before this tournament, it had been fairly successful on Magic Online. It had been seen in a couple of PTQs doing well, but it really hadn't made any sort of splash in the live arena. And of course, Daybreak Coronets are almost impossible to pick up these days. So therefore, it was going to be...
Future Sight wasn't really a set that was opened.
No, it was... Daybreak Coronet at the time was probably seen as the biggest waste of not a Tarmogoyf in Magic at that point, but unfortunately it's suddenly become a card that people are chasing and they become very hard to get hold of.
Now we've got something like 150 players in this PTQ, and only 2 of them turned up with this deck, so would you bother sideboarding against such a deck if we assume that there's rarely going to be more than 2 or 3 people in a room?
It really depends, because I mean, for one, we're featuring it quite heavily on the coverage here, and secondly, it has been having a lot more success on Magic Online. So it's a case of there's a little bit of a gap in February between PTQs, and with that, people might catch up a little bit to the tech. We always say that the UK PTQ scene is probably a couple of weeks to a month behind the online scene usually, but I would say that the interest in the deck will probably pick up, so you might see, depending on who can get the cards, you might see maybe 5 to 10 copies in the next PTQ.
Of course, we know there is one hate card in Gate Crash.
For the
one casting cost artifact to creatures lose hexproof.
There is that, but unfortunately that card is so narrow that I don't think that it will see I don't think it's going to see a monstrous amount of play, to tell you the truth. It's one of those cards. I think it's a bit of a trap card. It has very narrow applications, and I could be wrong about that for sure, but I think that for the most part it's just a little bit too narrow to be dedicating sideboard slots in Modern 2, unless this deck does explode.
I certainly didn't notice any new auras in Gate Crash that might help the deck either.
It's generally not the first thing you look for when looking at a spoiler is auras, but I didn't see too much. The only other thing I would say about this deck is that it's in the hands of 2 players in Matt Light and Neil Rigby. It's in the hands of 2 players who you would think would be favourites in an average UK PTQ field to head towards top 8 anyway. So the deck in their hands is probably going to overperform a little bit. So,
well, maybe that's just a case of all the other decks in everyone else's hands are going to underperform a little bit.
Possibly. I mean, we've seen you know, there's a lot of blue-white which we haven't really seen a lot of online. It's not done I mean, Eduardo Sajilik top-8'd Pro Tour with it recently, but apart from that, it generally has one good performer per like premier event, and then the rest of the decks are just Jund and other decks that turn up for the field. It just seems like it's a blue-white, certainly in the UK. It feels like it's a deck that's going to beat bad players. Or bad configurations of decks, and beyond that.
Now, in a way, you could argue that Jund is another deck where you don't really see a whole lot of interaction.
Not massively, no. Although the
most of the plays seem to be quite automatic. It's like you draw an abrupt decay. It's like target your best guy.
Yeah, there is some play to it, but there are obviously games where it is just simply drop your guys on the table, make Bloodbraid Elf turn 3 or 4, and just smash your opponent to pieces while he can't interact with you. But generally in a PTQ you're going to be forced to interact at some level at some point if you want to top 8 or do better at those PTQs.
Now, would you be a little bit worried about James's deck at this point, in that you know, he really had Matt locked down from quite an early stage, but he's taking such a long time to kill?
I don't think that's going to be a huge issue at this point. I think that Matt's just straight up. At this point, there's pretty much no way back into the game for Matt, I don't think, at this point.
I mean, in regards to the sort of the rest of the tournament, because he certainly won't get this amount of time against most decks.
I mean, his deck is designed to come out with fairly quick starts. I mean, as we saw in Game 1, he can make the turn 2 Smite to the turn 3 Wiltleaf Liege. If he doesn't get that sort of start, he kind of has to lean back on his Lingering Souls and his sort of main deck Kasali Pride Mage and Gaddock Tig, and just try and make things about as uncomfortable for his opponents as he potentially can.
Now, we're expecting a lot of Jund in this field, and that's obviously the deck. Whenever you're building a deck, you always have to go, you know, does it compete against Jund? I mean, how does Junk compare against that if it doesn't get this sort of blazing start?
It depends very heavily on what the Jund player does. If the Jund player just blindly makes a Liliana and +1s it, then the Jund player can end up being in all sorts of trouble, because James can just drop Wiltleaf Legion, play off the Liliana, and if the Jund player is careless, I would say the Junk player is going to be a favourite in that match the vast majority of the time. However, I would say that Jund definitely has a few issues with Junk if both decks get to the same amount, because I mean, a 4/4 is pretty big.
So in a case like that, you're saying that the Junk player is pretty much the aggro player, because the Jund player has the card advantage in his deck, you know, through cards like Liliana and obviously Bob and things like that. So really, James is probably the one who's going to have to be the aggressor in that kind of matchup.
Yeah, because I don't think James can really play control in that sort of matchup.
Yeah, I don't think he wins a long game. I think the longer it goes on.
I mean, he has Gavany Township, which can allow him to win a long game. It's one of the cards that Jund really doesn't want to see. If he can start chaining Lingering Souls together and just putting counters on it, that's one of the things that Jund's going to have a major problem dealing with. Unless, of course, because of the amount of cards that Jund has access to, Jund sometimes these days is going back to cards like Jund Charm. They also have access to cards like Fulminator Mage in their sideboard, which can deal with Gavany Township as well. So it's all really forming metagame decisions as best as they possibly can. But I think the main avenue for Junk against a deck like Jund is just to make as many 4/4s as possible, because Lightning Bolts aren't particularly effective against 4/4s.
So we're looking at the game now, and it looks like we're starting to get towards a conclusion in some way here.
Yeah, I think that Matt's beginning to slowly realise that there's not really many ways for him out of this. And with a 7/7 Wiltleaf Liege on one side of the board, eventually Matt's just going to have to give up the ghost.
Indeed, he does concede, so James wins this round 2-0.